Hello, everyone, Bible believers around the world. And in today's lesson, we're going to be covering something that many people may not know. So, in today's lesson, we're going to be talking about how the Caucasians, who are the sons and daughters of Japheth, were not always pale-skinned. Now, sons and daughters of the covenant of Yah inspired me to do this lesson because I was on his live stream on the Shabbat recently, and he was teaching that the ancient Greeks were not pale Caucasian people, that they were melanated people. And I didn't realize how deeply conditioned I was by Western doctrine about color, because I was thinking during his live stream, but the Greeks are Japhetic. So how could the Greeks be a melanated people, but then the other sons of Japheth we know are not, like Gomer and all them? I couldn't figure that out. But what I realized was that I had been conditioned by Western culture to think that color equals ethnicity. Because in Western society, we are taught that color and race and all that foolishness, that color is like a part of ethnicity. But in reality, Adam and Eve were people of color. So every nation at one point in history was melanated, was brown or so-called black. Every nation. And that doesn't mean family ties, because having melanin or dark skin is the same thing as having teeth. Everybody has teeth in their mouth, but that doesn't mean that they're the same nation, that they're all Israel, that they're all Hebrew, that they're all Moab. It doesn't mean that. But I was under that belief, which is a false belief. Because, for example, the Egyptians, the original Egyptians, that is, the Hamitic ones, were a swarthy Hamitic nation of people. The Israelites were a Negro nation of people. But despite us and Ham both being melanated, we are not the same nation and we do not share the same ancestors. All right? Brown skin is this humanity. It's not an ancestral trait. It's not a haplogroup. All right? So what we're going to be seeing today is that white people weren't even always white. Now, we've covered this in the past, specifically with the Caucasian Indian connection, because not all of the sons and daughters of Japheth are pale skinned today, neither, because we have Pakistanis and Indian people who are Caucasoid type people who range from brown to swarthy complexions. But despite that, they have the same features like straight hair, narrow noses, and they have the same Japhetic history as the pale Europeans, and they have a genetic connection to the pale Europeans, except they're black. So there's always been this question, was the seed of Japheth pale from the very beginning all the way back at Noah, or was it an evolutionary thing? And what we're going to see is it was an evolutionary thing. Because if you were to go back in time, thousands of years, close to the time of Tower of Babel period and Noah time period, Japheth, who we now know as white people, would have looked like Indians. They would have looked like these people right there. And the Europeans themselves are actually admitting this. But because of political white nationalism, they're trying to crush and silence these scientists, because European scientists have been coming forward for years showing the world that their ancestors were black just like everybody else, but nobody wants to see it. They want to hide that because of whiteness and all this type of stuff. So the white side of Japheth, because like we talked about the Indian and Pakistani situation, not all of them are even pale, but the pale-skinned Japheths have started to worship that color that they have developed. So now when they start to hear that they once used to be like Indians, they don't want to hear it. All right? Now, this introduction has to be long for a reason. Now I need to talk about what this really means for the Europeans, white people, Japheth, and expose the One West Camp doctrine. So the One West Camps like to say that, as we know, Japheth was black and Esau's the white man who stole Europe and changed his name to Japheth. That's not true. The Japhites are indeed the father of the Caucasoid peoples, but early on in history, they were people of color. Despite that, though, what we're going to see in this lesson is that we're not talking about Moors and we're not talking about scattered Israelites. We're not talking about Hamites. You see, what the One West camps like to do in their deceptive ways is they like to pull out portraits of Moors and Israelites and Hamites and say, see, that's Japheth, the white man's Esau. That's not true. Those people weren't Japheth. The Japheth is the Caucasoid peoples who lived among those Negroes and Hamitic peoples in Europe. Okay? Now, this is a completely different situation because the crazy thing about it is this completely explodes One West Camp doctrine, because these black peoples of Europe that we're going to be talking about today, these melanated peoples are genetically connected to the modern European. These weren't Israelites. These weren't Hamites. These weren't Moors. This is Japheth. And when you look at the DNA, these people are genetically related to the modern day white man. White people are descendants. Their ancestors were brown people. All right? I have to clear that up because, One West Camp is trying to see, Japheth was black, Esau's white. No. Japheth is the father of the Caucasian peoples as we know them today, but Caucasians weren't even always white. You go far enough back and they weren't even white, okay? Just like everybody else, we're going to look at the Chinese as a comparison because they're very similar with what has happened with the Europeans, all right? Esau's black. Israel is black. Moab is black. Egypt is black. And at one point, all of Japheth was black. But like I talked about with the analogy with the teeth, having teeth is just humanity. It's just Adam and Eve. It's not ancestral. Being black used to be everybody. It doesn't mean that you're a certain nation, that you're related to Jacob or whatever. Everybody was black. This is not a replacement type of thing. We've covered a lot on the channel about, Japheth replacing the Egyptians and replacing the Israelites. Esau didn't go into Europe and replace Japheth. For one thing, that whole doctrine falls apart when you realize that the Edomites themselves are black. So you're really saying black people went and replaced black people? So Esau didn't replace nobody. Esau's not the white man. What I'm saying is, and what we're going to be learning is that white people weren't always white. Japheth wasn't always white. Okay? I hope I explained that good. Now let's get started. Okay, I first want to talk about the Chinese, okay? Because the Chinese are a good example of what happened to the sons and daughters of Japheth, okay? So, same nation, but different skin tone. Skin tone is not ethnicity. You can have people of the same nation who have a wide range of skin tones. Here we have the president of China. And look how he has a more Caucasian, lighter skin tone. Here we have another Chinese man who is dark brown. But when you look at their features, you see they're both Chinese people. Very similar nose, similar hair, all right? So different skin tones happen among different nations of people. And you may say, is there any example in history of a nation getting lighter? There is, in fact. And it's the Chinese that we're talking about right now. Because when you look at ancient pictures of China, old pictures from like 100, 200, 300 years ago, and even further back, the Chinese look more like this man. They were dark-skinned people, swarthy. But you go to China now, and they range from medium brown to this. But here's the kicker, though. This is not a replacement thing. This is not a Japheth replacing Israel and Egypt thing. They're the same nation of people. They just got lighter. They're different shades. Because this man will have the same genetic makeup as this man. So the people who are in the land in China today are the same people who were in the land 400 years ago, but yet they look more like this and not like this. There you go. Okay, here's the crazy thing. So European scientists, when reconstructing their ancient ancestors from thousands of years ago, all the way back in the hunter-gatherer period, they depict them looking like this. See how he is a dark-skinned Caucasian with blue eyes and straight hair? This is what they say their ancestors look like. Now, so many white supremacists have swarmed in and tried to shut this down because we are really destroying white supremacy today. We are ripping it apart because if your clan member's ancestor from 5,000 years ago was this Indian-looking man, he's cooked because his ancestors were black. You see? And people be like, that don't look like, how's that the ancestor of the so-called white man? That don't look right. Watch this. That's the same portrait. All I did was lighten the skin. Everything's the same. Hair's the same. Skull's the same. Lips the same. Nose, ears, hair. Everything's the same. All I did was lighten his skin. So now we're starting to see what we talked about in the past when we looked at the albino Indians, on how albino Indian people literally just look like Europeans. So we take this swarthy dude right here, and let's say we give him an albino gene, white man. You see, this is so easy. It makes so much sense. We literally changed nothing but the skin tone. And according to the false doctrine we have today, we have a whole new race. But in reality, skin color, brown skin is humanity. It's not tied. Brown skin, being black, is not something that's copyrighted by Ham and Shem. It's not something that's copyrighted by the Hebrews and the Egyptians. Everybody was brown at some point. So in reality, this man, they're the same man, but hypothetically, this man and this man will be of the same nation, have the same genetic makeup, but skin tone's different. Everything else is the same, though. And talking about the Indian situation, I want you to take a guess. Which one of these photos do you think is the real one? Do you think it's the one on the left, or do you think it's the one on the right? Take a guess. It's the one on the left. When they were brown, black people, that's the real picture. Look at this man right here. That's what he really looked like. That dude, this young woman, they're brown. But look what happens to them when we lighten their skin. This guy looks like someone who was on the Titanic. Looks like a French woman. She could be from Turkey. You see, all we did was change the skin color. So what we're seeing is that thousands of years ago, the descendants of Japheth originally all looked like this. Okay? And now, add in white skin gene, and we have this. All right? Now, one thing I'd like to say, you may say, those photos look like AI. They're not AI. This is actually a real vintage photo I found of a brown/black Indian family on eBay, but it was in black and white. It wasn't in color. So I used AI to put it into color, and, it's not perfect, so it kind of makes it look cartoony, but it's real. Cheddar Man is another example. Cheddar Man is a dark-skinned, straight-haired, blue-eyed ancestor of Caucasians. But once again, the white supremacists have swooped in and said, no, that's not true. That's not true. He was pale. He was fair-skinned. But you see, we have another swarthy-looking Indian man who is the ancestor of white people. All right? This man, he's not Shem. He's not Ham. Like I'm saying, these people who we're looking at are black ancestors of white people. These people don't have a genetic trace to the Israelites or to other black nations, Edom, Moab, Ishmael, Canaan. They're going straight back to white people. These aren't Africans. These aren't Shemites. These are Japhites, and they're going straight to the white people, the genetic connection. Okay, here's a book that we've pulled out before on the channel. It's from 1940, I think it is, and it's called Sex and Race. That's the short name of it. But here's the page, or the part of the page where it talks about origin of the white race. Listen to this. There is no such thing as a white race. Why do we know this to be true? Because the Indians and the Pakistanis not only have the same features as the so-called white man, they have the same haplogroup as the so-called white man, and they have the same Japhetic history as the so-called white man. The only difference being that they are brown to black, and the white man is pale to sometimes pinkish. You see, there's no such thing as a white race because there's people who are genetically and historically and biblically family to the so-called white man, but they're not white, so they're not counted. All right? So, the whole false thing that's pushed by Republicans, once again, I'm not political because Democrats and Republicans both worship the devil. They don't love Yah, but just saying, this whole great replacement theory about the Republicans falls apart when you realize they shrink the size of their own nation on purpose because they don't count their melanated brothers and sisters. But let's keep going. There's no such thing as a white race, much as this is talked of, said Scoffed of her. I tried to pronounce that. But every white man, but let's say it again, but every white man is a faded or a bleached one. He's faded or bleached. And then it goes on to say, see, this is the University of Berlin was saying this. They wouldn't say this now. We know that the color of skin and hair are only the effect of environment, and that we are fair only because our ancestors lived for thousands of years, or probably tens of thousands of years, in sunless and foggy countries. Fairness is nothing else than a lack of pigment, and our ancestors lost part of theirs because they did not need it. See, lost some of theirs. They didn't say that they never had it. And this is back in the 40s before they could do all this reconstruction and all this DNA analysis. But even back then, they were aware that at one point they were brown. Okay, we're now going to be using the Google Gemini. Shout out to Sons and Daughters of the Covenant of Yah once again. So I asked the Google Gemini, were the ancient ancestors of white people dark-skinned? Short answer is yes. If you go back far enough in the evolutionary timeline, the ancestors of all modern humans, including those of European descent, had dark skin. This isn't just a theory, it's a conclusion drawn from a combination of evolutionary biology, archaeology, I think, and recent breakthroughs in ancient DNA analysis. Once again, we are talking about the ancestors of white people here. We're not talking about Moors. We're not talking about scattered Israelites. We're not talking about any of the other Hebrew nations. We're talking about the so-called white man, Japheth. His ancestors were black, just like everybody else. Now, let's go read some more. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the Noah situation. Because Noah was the father of humanity as we know it today. Because his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, populated the entire earth. Now, Noah was albino, so he had the genes of fair skin inside of him because of that albinoism. Now, that makes sense for the origin of Japheth's whiteness. Noah would be the father of white skin and making that possible for humans because he was the first human to be born pale-skinned. As we exposed so many times, Esau was not the father of white skin. He was a black man. He was a man of color. He was ruddy, Admoni, and his ancestors were black. So we know that Japheth got his pale skin from Noah, the possibility for it, because as we've also covered, pale-skinned Europeans existed before Esau was even born, all right? And Esau himself was a man of color. So not only did pale Japheth types exist before Esau, but Esau himself wasn't even white. So we know that. But let's read what the Google Gemini had to say. I asked, from a biblical perspective, how would Noah being an albino affect humanity, especially his son Japheth becoming the modern Europeans? It says, this is a fascinating intersection of theological tradition and genetics. While the Bible itself doesn't explicitly state that Noah was albino, this idea comes primarily from the Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish religious work, which describes Noah's birth in a way that many modern readers interpret as albinoism. According to Enoch 106, Noah was born with white skin, as white as snow and red as a rose, and hair white like wool. If we apply this Noah as albino premise to the Table of Nations, Genesis chapter 10, here's how it would theoretically affect the lineage of Japheth and the origin of the Europeans. The genetic founder. In genetic terms, if Noah had albinoism, a recessive trait, he would be a founder. For his son Japheth to become the ancestor of modern Europeans with light skin, two things would have to happen biblically / theology. I think I got that wrong. Carrying the trait. Noah would pass the genes for lack of pigmentation to his sons. Even if Ham and Shem didn't express it as fully, the genetic blueprint for light skin would be present in the post-flood gene pool. See, right there. So because of Noah, the genetic blueprint for light skin would be present in the gene pool of the post-flood world. Let's keep going. The Japhetic migration. Biblical tradition places the descendants of Japheth in the Isles of the Gentiles, Europe and Asia Minor. From a biological perspective, if Japheth's lineage carried these white genes into the colder climates of Europe, those traits would have been naturally selected for, as discussed earlier, regarding vitamin D, leading to a permanent population shift. Let's read a little more. The bottleneck theory. From a literal biblical perspective, the flood represents a genetic bottleneck. All human diversity today would have to come from just 8 people: Noah, his wife, and his three sons and their wives. If Noah was albino, it suggests that the potential for extreme light skin was contracted right at the bottleneck in this view. Japheth, traditionally the father of the Europeans, inherited and stabilized these lighter traits. Ham and Shem, traditionally the fathers of the African and the Semitic peoples, would have retained or reverted to the original darker pigmentations through their mothers or through different environmental adaptations. Okay, we are now going to go to the Babylon from Timbuktu book, because we've covered in the SLC, in the lesson where we talked about that the SLC 24A5 is not the Esau gene, where we exposed that it's not Esau. We talked about the sons and daughters of Japheth, starting having a presence in Turkey, all right? And the Europeans have been talking about the Caucasus Mountains for hundreds of years, all right? So we're going to read a little bit of that right here. We have more than adequate proof that the white races began near the Caucasus Mountains, and from there they spread north and northwest and northeast into Europe, Aztec Russia. Now, I think I pronounced that really bad. Asiatic Russia. Boom, got it. I'm fixed. Now we know that the Japhites, Europeans, are white today. Were they originally white beginning from their ancestor Japheth? According to the Europeans themselves, no. Or did a change materialize in the skin color of the descendants of Japheth? Yes, it did. This question is difficult to answer. I was told that Japheth was a black man, but he wanted to be white, so God changed him to a white man. Evidence to that theory is lacking. Nevertheless, science and anthropologists have found different kinds of mutations in certain parts of the world. A physical mutation is a sudden variation or change. See, sudden variation or change, the offspring differing from its parents in some outstanding characteristic. Also, a major change in the chromosomes or genes that determine hirsutus, blonde hair among the black aborigines is an example of a mutation. And probably albinos are a good example of mutations with their white skin, woolly hair, thick lips, and Ethiopian noses. Any sudden change from the normal is to be regarded as a mutation. Okay, just like we covered with the Indian thing. The Indians already have the Caucasus features, but they're black though. So what happens when you get a black person with Caucasian features and then they get the albino gene? They become a so-called white man. We've covered that on the channel already. Any sudden change from the normal is to be regarded as a mutation. Other examples of mutation are blondism or whiteness among monkeys, apes, and chimpanzees. Major mutations or changes took place among the descendants of Japheth. This is obvious because of their white skin. In other words, they were black at one time, but the skin changed to white. This phenomenon can be understood in the view of the total world population. Over 2/3 of the population of the world consists of colored people. That is a ratio of 2 to 1. 2 out of Noah's 3 sons remained black. We know this to be true because many of the people throughout Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the islands in the Pacific are yellow, brown, or black. They have facial features like the Congoid Africans, especially the Vietnamese, Filipinos, and people of India. They are a mix of black Dravidians and Indo-Europeans. Yeah, India is a mix. You have the Caucasoid Japhetic Indo-European ones, and then you have the Dravidian, Hamitic, some Israelite ones. All right, so that was very key to show, okay? That was very key. Let's move on. Okay, look at this. Here are albino Indians. Looks like a man I saw at the gas station in Utah. Explains everything. Look at this man. Is he British? No, he's not. You see, changing the skin color changes so much when the people already have the features. Looks like someone I saw on the playground when I was a kid growing up in a Christian church. You see that? And the crazy thing is, with albinoism, so often blue eyes and yellow hair come with it. Take a look at this. Would you believe me if I told you that the people on the left are not Indians, but they are Europeans who I just gave dark skin? These are European people with dark skin. And this is what you get. You see? So, this is what the earliest descendants of Japheth would have looked like. And what we have today in Europe is just the albino version of this. We've seen that. So, what we've learned today is that black skin, it's not even black skin, but being so-called black or melanated is not something that's been copyrighted by the Hebrews and by the Egyptians. Adam and Eve were people of color, and we all started off as people of color. You know, as sons and daughters of the covenant of Yah said, we're all more similar than we think. A lot of this clan foolishness has just divided the world and made us hate each other when it's not even necessary. All right. And as we looked at the Chinese as an actual historical example of proof of a nation of people having gotten lighter over time and being of the same nation, the same genetic makeup, but some being dark and some being light, we see the proof of that. You know, One West camps, their doctrine is false. You know, there was no white Esau that came in and replaced, Japheth. This is what Japheth looked like thousands of years ago back in Noah's day. And the white version that we have today, which is what we call the Europeans, are just the albino version of this. And the Indians and Pakistanis just simply have always looked like that. And we know that to be true based on the science. That's what the Europeans are telling us. We're going after their own sources. All right? Black Esau, which is who he really is, doctrine makes no sense. So in reality, they're saying Black Esau went into Europe and messed with Japheth. So how did Esau whiteify Europe when he's a black man, his descendants are black, as we've covered, and the Most High Yah's great wisdom has shown us. So anyways, thanks for being with us on this adventure. I pray that this has helped you have some understanding, because people have debated for decades on if Japheth was, white, was the so-called white man coming out of the womb, or if it was an evolutionary thing. We know evolution, animal evolution, is false, but we see historic examples of mutations and developments and evolution with human appearances. We do see that. So, based on the evidence that the Europeans give their scientists, and based on the genetics, and Adam and Eve being people of color, it leads to the conclusion that the earliest Japhethites look like these people. All right, and the Europeans are just albinos of that. Okay, so the question that we didn't ask ourselves was, what part of the Middle East does this white skin gene actually come from? And we're about to find out some shocking, explosive information. So this white skin gene originated in Turkey. And look at this. It is bordered by the Black Sea to the north and the Mediterranean Sea to the south. So we know that the sons and daughters of Japheth, during their barbarian period, spent time in the wilderness of Turkey before going into Europe. So right now, we're reading that the white skin originated in Turkey. We know that Japheth started in Turkey. All right? Not only that, but we know that Japheth lived near the Black Sea. The Black Sea's right here. And it's about to get even crazier, because guess what? The Caucasus Mountains run through Turkey. That's right, the Caucasus Mountains. Remember, we covered this in the Japheth, True Father of the Caucasoid Peoples lesson. Look at this. 3 sons of Gomer are mentioned. Ashkenaz, whose name seems to compose of Gothic roots, the race of asses, which represents the Germanic and Scandinavian nations not yet separated and inhabiting a limited district to the northeast of the Black Sea. The Black Sea again. Okay, we're now going to be looking at a source written by an Islamic dude, and this is going to be very deep, and he covers the Turkey-Japheth connection. Early history shows the Japhethites split into two groups. One group split in the region of present-day India and Central Asia. Remember, we talked about that before, the Indian-Caucasian connection in Central Asia, and the other group in the European theater. Indo-European languages originate from those people groups who migrated throughout Western Eurasia, Europe, the Near East, Anatolia, and the Caucasus. Remember, Anatolia, Turkey, and the Caucasus. You see right here? Let's read that again. Indo-European languages originate from those people groups who migrated throughout Western Eurasia, Europe, the Near East, Anatolia, and the Caucasus. Okay, right here is Turkey. This is where this fair-skinned gene originated. And look just above Turkey, the Lesser Caucasus Mountains. And then up here, we have the Greater Caucasus, Georgia in between there. So we already know about Japheth and the Caucasus Mountains. But now we have this fair-skinned gene originating in Turkey. And look, just like we talked about earlier, the Caucasus Mountains run through Turkey.